All right, so this is a sensor. It's what's called a plethysmograph sensor, and it measures the heart rate activity based on light. So you've probably seen the sensors that go on the finger, the pulse oximeter type of sensors. It works in that way. There are some of the sensors for heart rate variability are going to be plethysmograph, and they're going to either go on the earlobe or they clip onto a finger. There are also EKG type sensors that are either going to go on the torso or the wrists in many cases. And some of the reasoning for choosing sensors and all what we'll talk about a little bit later in the equipment part of it. But a lot of it can have to do with ease of use, you know, depending on what population you're working with, how much time you have with them, and so on. It may be easier to just clip a sensor on somebody's ear or finger than say, okay, I need to put sensors on your torso, or even putting the sensors on the wrist. Sometimes it's just a little bit more work to do that. So this just clips onto the earlobe, and then this piece in this system plugs into a device that plugs into a USB port. So I'm going to plug that in here. And probably you're all familiar with the way that the plethysmograph sensor works. It's shining a light into the skin and measuring how it comes back to calculate things like the interbeat interval and heart rate. So
It's based on blood flow.
So
blood volume to wherever it is. So the more blood there is, the more reflectance there is.
I'm going to read the practice patient, and if you guys are interested in practicing,
Yeah,
we
we
encourage
would like
you.
to have someone come up and.
Yes, actually, I'm just going to be a practice patient to begin with. I wanted to show you what Harry is going to show you what this is happening.
So this is the heart rate signal here.
It's picking real time. Now, what I do with the patients is we want the breathing, and if it's coherent, you're going to hear a high bell right and you hear a low or gong. How I'm going to train the patient is to look at their heart rate and synchronize the breath with the heart rate. That's what we're going to do right now. So let me just do it, just as a sample. See? Heart methods are all these ways to give you cues. They're color bars. The red is not good. The green is good. How do you stop this? Where is this? Stop button. And then now I'm nervous, but I'm going to try to get myself green.
Oh, get out of here.
You want to stop it?
Yeah, I'm going to start again. Okay.
Okay. And by the way, those red marks that you were seeing, that's marking an artifact. So maybe she might have moved or something like that, or it just says it wasn't able to keep up with the changes, or the change that it saw didn't make sense. So that's why it puts that there. This is the pulse, and so that's what it does at the beginning, just to make sure that it's picking up the heartbeat, and then it starts to graph it at the top here. This is a pacer that they put there that can be adjusted. You can plus minus there to show. So they would be inhaling as it's going up and exhaling as it's coming down.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but is that at 6 per minute?
I'm not sure what it's set at right now.
This is what the biofeedback's about, is about visualizing a pacer for your breath and how that relates to changes in heart. There is the Sonia that we know and love.
So now when he talked about variability, this is the variation. So if it was like this,
Then that would be low variability.
and where it is now, that's sort of higher variability there.
So above is the tachygram and below is the frequency spectrum.
But here it's about 3.5 breaths. So that's where the
It's me. That
That's
would be
very
me too.
slow.
That would be me
Most
too.
people can't. Most people can't breathe that slowly, but that is still a beautiful. That's an absolutely beautiful. So when I said, you know, it'd be so there are differences, and the typical range, the data that I've seen, which is run on samples of, and I mean this in normal, but you know, like college students and you know, a non-clinical population. The frequency range is about 5 up to about 7 cycles per minute. Sonia is just below that. That's just her individual, and that's very unique.
And you'll find some people are very uncomfortable breathing that slow. I've worked with people that starting out their resting breathing rate was 18 breaths a minute.
Yeah.
20 breaths a minute. So now, if I set the pacer at 6 and say, okay, now follow this pacer, they're like, I can't do it, you know. So sometimes I'll have to bring it up to like 10 breaths a minute and possibly work my way down, our way down to a pace that is closer to what we're, you know, our goal would be. But another thing I find is that if it's really uncomfortable for them, they're probably not going to practice. So I think sometimes I have to work with them to get to where it's comfortable. And sometimes I'll have it set at 10 and they're saying, well, this is still really slow. You know, so you have to work on it. And I've found it important to ask a person how they feel when they're breathing at this pace. Because if it's, you know, they might feel lightheaded for a while, they might feel a little dizzy because their CO2
right.
and all is changing. So you may need to work on it. And the question came up before about, you know, how the person would feel, you know, when they're in coherence, and also, you know, with the 6 breaths a minute, when you're walking around or you're at the office or in the car or whatever, even if you're going to be in situations where you couldn't even use something that's going to be on your phone, but if you want to regulate your physiology at that time, you can still slow your breathing down. You might not know whether you're at 6 or 6.5 or 7 or 5.5, but you still can feel like your state is changing. And I think that's an important thing. And if you've practiced at a certain rate, you should be able to approximate it. Like even what Sonia was doing, she purposely was not using the pacer because she knows the way she breathes, it was not going to be comfortable using the pacer where it was set. And for her, that's, you know, that works.
The whole point of this is if I'm coherent, sparks blow out, and it's green fire that comes out. The patients really like this.
So
You know?
there's
It's
3
fun.
different colors. If you're doing really well, it's going to be green. Then below that would be blue, and if you're not doing so good, it will be red. The color of the stars or sparks, whatever you're getting.
Did you feel any difference earlier when you were doing the breathing?
She's in the room.
You know, I'm gonna stop this because
No,
I
no,
want to see you guys see the
You
brain.
can't possibly be nervous right now.
I want to make it harder so that you see the.
You're supernovaing.
Well, it just goes to show with practice.
Wait,
even-
I think
question.
it's
What
something
was-
you have to practice. You know.
I would, another thing I would bring in, related to what Jack was saying earlier, the breathing is a big component, but then, and some people will say that that's all you need to do, but then there's the emotional part of it that I think when combined, it's the most effective. At first, when I started learning about heart rate variability, and one of the people that he mentioned is related to, it's called the HeartMath Foundation, I believe. And they do a lot of work with heart rate variability, and there's actually the software that we're using now is their software. But they are really big on the emotional part and the feeling of what were some of the terms you used?
Gratitude,
Gratitude, compassion. And for some people, that language is a problem, you know.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, they're gonna be like, oh, you know. And I have to admit, at first, I was like, yeah, you know, just tell me about the breathing, because you know that I can just do. But I learned that really does have something to do with it. And in fact, I use this software on my work computer in the office, and I would train at least 5 minutes a day. And I noticed one time I had it on, you know, it was green the whole time. I was doing great, and I was doing the breathing mechanically, but then it turned red while I was still doing the breathing, what I would say perfectly, but I noticed I had a negative thought at that moment, and it turned red. And when I got my emotional state back to more positive, it turned green again. So one can cause it to change. And so that could also go to, we talked about when you're talking, and you can't really do the breathing while you're talking. The part of the reason why I brought it up was to say that even if there are times that let's just say it's harder or more challenging to do the breathing in the same way you would do if you were not talking. Sure. You could still be in an emotional state that would be more coherent. This is actually what I was using most of the time when I was using it at work.
Yeah, there you go.
'Cause this only takes like 3 minutes. So I would just do it like in between phone calls and stuff like that to just kind of recenter and calm down.
Depends on how good you are, right?
Well, if you're not doing well, like you'll go through the 3 minutes and you won't get all this color and everything filled in. But if you're doing well, then you'll make it through to the end, before the 3 minutes is up. And there's another game that's like 5 minutes, another one that's like 10 minutes. So it's just different ways of doing it, but it's all based on the heart rate variability in the background. And in fact, you see on the bottom lower, it's showing either green, blue, or red there. So if it's blue or green, you're gonna get the feedback. If it's red, it's gonna kind of just hang out and wait for you to get back into a coherent state. So he's gonna have. Again, it's going to be either red, blue, or green waves coming.
What's good?
It's good, blue or green. Green is the best. Blue is sort of in the middle, and red is not good. So it's like I guess the concept of this is that you're generating energy to the world. So while she's doing that, one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later, I think I just heard Jack mention about that with some of the equipment, you'll also be actually measuring the breathing. In this case, we're measuring the heart rate activity, but not the breathing, although the heart rate activity is affected by the way that the person is breathing. When he showed on one of the earlier slides the synchronization of the breath and the heart rate, in order to actually see that, you do need to be measuring the breath. And so we'll demonstrate that a little bit later, after we look at some research.
You're doing great.
Just breathing.
Well, there you go.
And one of the things that I find really powerful about this whole thing is how many people have heard someone tell them to take a deep breath when they were getting upset or anxious or angry, and the person that is hearing that probably just wants to smack the person that told them to take a deep breath because they don't believe it does anything. But now when you can show changes in what's going on with your heart based on shifts that you make in your breathing, it at least gets people's attention. And even what we were talking about mindfulness and those types of things before. Sometimes the biofeedback part can sort of be a bridge to people to kind of step into the whole thing about mindfulness and the positive imagery and so on, because once they see something concrete, then they can start to believe and listen to some of the other stuff.
Yes. What this is doing is giving a quantitative, physiological, anatomical, scientific basis for what's been known traditionally throughout the world, but particularly in other parts of the world, for a very long time. And that's what's new about it, this idea about breath control and about emotion control and mindfulness. Those are not new ideas. Those are things that have been done in low-tech or no-tech environments. What's happened, though, is that the basis of it now is becoming elaborated, and the utility of it. And so we're giving the foundation, the understanding. And that's what convinces a lot of people is, well, why should I believe it? Because at the subjective level, it seems right, it's probably been tested a long time, but we just don't have the the quantitative aspect, or that's what this is doing. This is giving you an explanation, a scientific explanation for a traditional, something that's traditional truth and wisdom.
Yeah, you don't have to convince people that what's going on with their heart is important, so if we can give them something that they can have with them all the time, that they can use to regulate what's going on with their heart, it seems to get their attention.